All right, well, good morning. We're going to be we're going to spend most of our time in Luke, but I want to spend a little bit of time in Mark. So turn to both Mark 14 and Luke 22 this morning to start out with. We'll be hopping back and forth between several of the Gospels, especially as we come towards this crucial moment of the crucifixion. We're going to see a lot of different details being shown by different of the gospel writers. Many times, a lot of the gospels, when they all tell the same story, they'll all include many of the same elements with one or two divergent details. But especially as we come towards the trial, crucifixion, resurrection, the gospel writers are going to have very different perspectives depending on the leading of the Holy Spirit, of course, and also depending on where they were during this time period. It is believed that all four of the gospel writers, three of them I should say, not with the exception of Luke, although it is entirely possible that Luke was there, but three of them, Matthew, Mark, and John, were there. For sure we know of John being there. We know that Matthew was there for a little bit of it. We'll talk a little bit about where Mark shows up at some point, if that is indeed him. He's not mentioned by name, but several scholars and some tradition dictates that John Mark was there at the crucifixion. So three of the four were likely there during this time, and then Luke has his own unique perspective, and we're going to spend most of our time in Luke because he's the one who offers the most detail, which would make sense if he was a physician, as is pointed out in the book of Acts. It is, of course, reasonable that he would include a lot more of the physical details surrounding these events. So we'll be jumping back and forth between a lot of these, but just as a real quick reminder, where we left off last time was what we call the Last Supper, what the Jews would call Passover, and we talked a little bit about the significance of the Passover and how Jesus is that Passover lamb that was about to be sacrificed to protect us from death. And so now the supper is finished. The last thing we looked at was he told Peter that Peter was going to betray him. And so now they're going out, they've sung their hymn, and they go out into the night. And so Jesus takes his disciples with him to a secluded area, a place called Gethsemane. What's interesting here is that when he takes the disciples, he separates them into two groups. Now, we've already seen where Jesus has kind of separated the disciples before. If you recall, when we talked about Jesus' transfiguration, he did not take all of the disciples with him. He only took with him Peter, James, and John. And certainly these three would become very key leaders in the early church shortly after Christ's ascension into heaven. So Jesus has already kind of marked them out as being those principal leaders. Now, that's not to say the other disciples weren't leaders. They certainly were, and they went off and to different missionary endeavors and things like that. But it seems that Jesus has a special purpose for these three. So we'll see in Mark chapter 14. This is the only thing I want to look at here is verses 32 and 33. And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he saith to his disciples, Sit ye here while I shall pray. And he taketh with him Peter and James and John, and began to be sore amazed and be very heavy. So he separates them here into two groups. The only reason I turn to Mark here is because Luke does not include this detail in his account, but Matthew and Mark do. So I just wanted to point that out as part of our first note, that Jesus did separate his disciples into two groups, and then he separated himself from even them, as you would see in verse 34 of Mark chapter 14. But we'll go back to Luke chapter 22. He came out and went, as he was wont, to the Mount of Olives. So that's where this little garden would have been named. So you have the whole mount, and then on this mount you have a small plot of land, a small garden named Gethsemane, and that's where he takes his disciples. And so this is not the first time he's been on the Mount of Olives. He usually would come here while he was in Jerusalem. It was an area to get away from the crowds. And certainly on this feast night, people are either still busy partaking in their feast, or they're finished cleaning up, getting ready for the next day. And so everything is going to be pretty quiet around here. And when he was at the place, he saith unto them, Pray that ye enter not into temptation. So he tells his disciples as he separates them and as he gets ready to depart from them, pray that ye enter not into temptation. Jesus knows what's coming here. We've talked about this before. The crucifixion was not some kind of accident. It wasn't a, oh, whoops, I didn't want that to happen kind of moment, as several cults like to teach. Jesus knew what was happening, and he forewarns the disciples, pray that ye enter not into temptation. The temptation to abandon him, the temptation to fall into sin. They're about to be, as he mentions in a different passage, they're about to be sheep without a shepherd. So he tells them, be watchful, be ready, because he's not going to be there anymore. And so then he goes off and he does his own praying. Verse 41, when he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. When he rose up from prayer and was come to his disciples, he found them sleeping for sorrow, and said unto them, Why sleep ye? Rise and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. Now, in the other accounts, in the Matthew and Mark account, John does not record this event. Basically, in the account of John, he goes from preaching and talking about Peter betraying him straight to when he is arrested, and John kind of cuts this whole section out. But in the other two accounts, Matthew and Mark, this discourse between Jesus and finding the disciples sleeping and rebuking them happens 3 times. The first 2 times, he goes back, he rebukes them and says, What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Pray that ye enter not into temptation. And then on the 3rd time, he tells them to rest. So I don't exactly know how long of a time period is going on here. Certainly long enough that by the time Jesus is crucified later on, it's daylight. So they finish the supper, which is in the evening time. They go into the garden, they're praying, or Jesus is praying for quite a significant period of time, long enough that they have time to sleep 3 times. And on the 3rd time, he actually tells them to go ahead and rest, before then the soldiers come and arrest him. And that we don't know how long the trials took. We don't know how long it would have taken for them to ship Jesus from one place to another within Jerusalem, as we'll see. But certainly enough time goes by that the disciples are able to get some rest. Jesus is able to pray. And then, as we'll see later, the crucifixion happens during the daytime. So Jesus here is agonizing in prayer, and he keeps bringing up this idea of, let this cup pass from me. And there's some cultural context here. Why does Jesus use this terminology specifically? Well, oftentimes throughout the Old Testament, and even once you get into the even in the New Testament, especially once you get to Revelation, the idea was that God's wrath was often in a cup being poured out. You would have God's wrath being mentioned as being like a wine press, where those who God was wrathful at would be trodden down under the foot of God, and almost like they would be turned into wine, and that wine of God's wrath would be collected in a cup and then poured out on the earth. It's interesting, if you were to look at Revelation, if you were to go through the different prophetic events that are happening there, the seals and the trumpets are God's judgment, but then it's not until you get to the vials that it becomes called God's wrath. And it's being literally poured out onto the earth. And so the idea here is that when Jesus says, let this cup pass from me, it's a reference to the cup of God's wrath, to the cup of suffering that he would be undertaking for the sins of the world. Interestingly enough, if you go through the Passover supper, they do not drink just one cup in the supper. There are actually, I think, if I recall correctly, I believe I mentioned this last time, there are, I believe, 6 different cups that they drink from. And one of those cups is specifically the cup of God's wrath. And it is believed that that is the one that when Jesus says, "Take, drink, this is my blood," that is the one that he was holding when he passed it around. The Bible doesn't say for sure that is part of a traditional aspect of it, but it is interesting that in the traditional Seder meal, in the Passover meal that they would have just partaken in, there is a cup that is referencing God's wrath. And in the context, it's referencing God's wrath being poured out over the land of Egypt on that 10th plague. And so Jesus knows that he's about to undergo immense suffering. And if there was any other way, I'm sure that way would have been taken. But there was no other way. The wages of sin is death. The only way that sin could be atoned for was by the death of the person who sinned, or by the death of a blameless substitute. And so this was the only way that Christ was going to be able to pay for his sin. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine. Now, a lot of people have tried to use this to say, well, God or Jesus was subservient to the Father. See here, he's disagreeing with God on the way things need to be done, and I don't see that. Knowing that Jesus is God, but that Jesus is also human, we've seen multiple times where it appears that his humanity and his deity conflict, and that's where you get all kinds of different heresies, such as Docetism or Arianism. But in the end, you have to realize that Jesus here, as a human, is about to undergo immense suffering, but as God, he knows it must be done. And so there is no contradiction here between Christ's humanity and deity. Christ is not a created being. Christ is not somehow of a lesser being than the Father. Here we just see Christ's humanity and his deity at the same time working themselves out. And so, as I've already said, the disciples at this point are sleeping. There's a couple reasons for this, and I know sometimes we like to, we come through these and we see the disciples doing something that Jesus rebukes them for, and we like to say, the disciples, how could they do that? Why would they disappoint Jesus so? But let's bear in mind 2 things here. First of all, they're really tired. It's been a long week. They've been preparing for the feast. They've been up for quite a period of time. It's late at night. They're really tired. If I was in this situation, I would probably be right there trying to find a comfortable place to sleep. Bear in mind that, Jesus has no home. There is no home base for Jesus. And so they didn't have necessarily anywhere to sleep. And often, I would imagine them sleeping in the wilderness was kind of a common thing. Whenever they were in a town that either rejected Jesus or nobody wanted to nobody had any room for them to sleep, they would have been stuck sleeping out of doors. So this would not necessarily have been an uncommon occurrence for them. Just, all right, we're here on the Mount of Olives. We don't have a place to stay. We're just going to camp out right here and sleep right here. This would have been about middle spring. So it would have probably been a little chilly, but not so much so that sleeping out of doors would have been impossible. I thought, there's probably some people in here who are like, we go camping in the middle of winter. What are you talking about? I know there are some people like that. I think those people are nuts, just like I think ice fishermen are nuts. But, to each their own. Either way, it's middle spring, so it's not so cold that sleeping out of doors would have been unlikely. But certainly they would have been tired from all the events that had been going on around the feast. And let's also bear in mind, how do we feel after Thanksgiving? Usually most of us have eaten so much that we feel like sleeping. Okay, they just had a big feast. There is not a small amount of food at a Passover supper. There is quite a large amount of food. They had to eat an entire lamb all on their own. And sure, there's 12 people, but takes, a lamb is significantly bigger than a turkey, and if a small family devouring an entire turkey is a large meal, I'm sure 13 people devouring an entire lamb would have been quite a bit. Because remember, according to the book of Exodus, they couldn't leave anything until morning. Everything had to be eaten. Whatever wasn't eaten had to be burned. So they're full. They're stuffed. They've had a hard day. They're really tired. And then also, Jesus has been acting very sorrowful. there's been a lot going on emotionally during this time. And that can be very draining on a person physically. The emotions emotions do affect the physical body. And so with all the stuff that's been going on, with Jesus talking about one of them betraying him, with Jesus mentioning that he's going to die, with him rebuking Peter and telling Peter that he's going to betray him 3 times or deny him 3 times, with the fact that he's talking about them being sheep with no shepherd. This is a very serious time for them. This is not a happy celebration by any means. And so not only are they tired from all the stuff that's been going on, they've stuffed their faces full of food, and now, Jesus has set a very somber tone. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I receive bad news, it feels even worse when I'm very, very tired. If I haven't gotten a lot of sleep because of illness or perhaps something major happened, or I was very busy with a lot of work and I wasn't able to fully rest properly. When suddenly bad news comes, I know in myself I take it a lot worse when I'm very tired. And so they've been very tired, they've been very busy, Jesus has been teaching, they've been preparing the feast, they've eaten the feast, and Jesus dumps a whole bunch of bad news on them. They're tired, they're weary, they're going to fall asleep. That's just the physical capacity. Now, in Christ, could they have found the strength physically to stay up and pray? Sure. They could have. But let's face it, if I was in their position, and I would imagine most of us, if we were in their position, we would have said, okay, I can either stay up and pray, like Jesus said, or I can catch a few minutes of sleep while he's off praying. I think I'm going to catch up on a few minutes of sleep because it doesn't look like we're going to find anywhere of long-term rest anytime soon. So I might as well rest while I can. At which point Jesus eventually does give them that permission without rebuking them. So I just pointed out that sometimes we like to judge people who do wrong in the scriptures harshly, not realizing that we ourselves in that situation would probably do very much the same thing. Yes. And so now we come. Jesus has allowed the disciples to rest, and then all of a sudden the garden is filled with activity. Soldiers show up, likely not Roman soldiers. I know a lot of illustrations like to say that it was Roman soldiers there, but bear in mind that the Roman soldiers would have had no need to go after Jesus at this point. The Roman soldiers would have showed up if Jesus had been already accused of insurrection or of leading a rebellion or anything like that. So likely these are the temple guards that show up, the personal guard of the religious leaders who would have had them there to protect the money changers, the banks. There probably would have been a heightened security there because it's the feast time. And so it's the temple guard that shows up with Judas to arrest Jesus, not the Roman soldiers. I just say that because I don't know why. A lot of times when I see pictures of Jesus being arrested in the garden, they're wearing Roman soldier regalia, and I don't really know why, because it would not have been the Roman soldiers that were there. So anyways, Jesus then is arrested. Continuing on in Luke chapter 22, while he yet spake, behold, a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them, and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. And Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? And so here, Jesus then is, he's finished talking to the disciples, they've had their rest. Now the guards show up with Judas, and the sign that Judas told the guards that he would give was that he would go up to Jesus and give him a kiss. And again, contextually, culturally speaking, men kissing one another was somewhat common. I went to Greece, or my parents lived in Greece for 2 years while I was in college. When I would visit them every Christmas break, it was a little bit of a culture shock because I would walk into the church, and my parents, even though they were only there for 2 years, but apparently they were very well looked upon by the church. Everyone knew them, everyone liked them. Again, I wasn't there, but it was a big deal when I came home to visit them while they were there. I don't know if it was because I was studying to get my preaching degree and that church had a very big emphasis on evangelism. I don't know what it was, but for me not knowing them and them just like asking me to preach in their pulpit, I was like, that's a little odd. They don't know who I am, and yet they're asking me to preach in their pulpit. But every time I would come, there would be this huge hullabaloo, and all of these guys would come up and they would start kissing me on the cheek. And my parents had told me to prepare for this, so it wasn't like the first time it happened, it was like severely shocking. But at the same time, it was, we don't do that here in the United States. And in fact, in most of, if you go west of, I guess the Italy-Germany border, if you were to take Europe and split it where west is anything west of Italy and Germany and east is anything east of Italy and Germany, most of Western Europe doesn't do that either, at least as far as men with men. You might see women doing it. I remember when I was in South America and Latin America, often women would greet one another with a kiss, but men wouldn't. Men would just usually kind of from a distance, give like a little head nod or something like that in acknowledgement of one another. But the women, they would come up to each other, they would kiss each other on the cheek and things like and stuff like that. So culturally speaking, this would have been completely normal. It's not like Judas here is doing something way out of the ordinary. And certainly, it would have been something where the rest of the disciples might not have known what was going on. Because nobody really here challenges Judas except for Jesus, likely this was a common occurrence when the disciples would leave and come back. That's how they would greet one another. Again, I'm not really 100% for sure. That's one of those things that's kind of hard to research archaeologically speaking. And as the ages progress, guys kissing one another as a greeting is becoming less and less I guess popular in even areas and cultures where it was a very common practice. But nonetheless, when you talk about people greeting each other with a kiss, I will say this is not something that necessarily everybody does. And this is what was that's why it was kind of odd to me going to my parents' church in Greece and having all of the men kiss me, was that usually that is reserved for people who you know well. You don't just go up to a random stranger and kiss them. Okay, usually it would be a friend or a family member. Now, obviously, being a part of the family of God and them knowing my family meant that it was perfectly okay for them to feel comfortable doing that with me. But it's not like if I walked into some random store, the store owner would greet me with a kiss. I was a stranger. And so one would not kiss a complete stranger. You would reserve it for people who you knew well. And so again, this would not, for Judas to come up and do this, would not necessarily have seemed strange, but it also explains why Jesus says, that's also why Jesus says, comest thou to betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss. Judas here is saying, by kissing Jesus, you are a close friend, you are like family to me.
Yes.
But in doing that, he is betraying Jesus to the guards. I've often wondered this too. Why did the guards need to know who Jesus was? Like, why did they need this signal? And that has baffled me. I have thought about this for years and years and years. Jesus is a well-known figure at this point. Why would the guards need some kind of sign to indicate who Jesus was? The only thing I could come up with is the passage in Isaiah 53 where it talks about Jesus looking completely ordinary. There was nothing about him physically that stood out. And so in the dark, when the only light you have is torchlight, my only assumption is they couldn't have picked him out from a crowd in the dark with only torchlight because of how just ordinary he was. That's the only thing I could think of. That's just my opinion, because I have sat there and wondered, Jesus is a well-known figure. Why would they need Jesus to be picked out of a lineup?
Right.
That's the only thing I could think of, is that's how ordinary looking he was. So Judas betrays him. In John, we'll turn over to John now, because John offers a bit of extra insight into this. Most of the other accounts, they just talk about them coming, Jesus being arrested. A couple of them mention the high priest's servant's ear being cut off. John is the only one that mentions this one. The guards come, verse 4 of John 18. Jesus therefore knowing all things that should come upon him. Okay, again, Jesus knows what's going on here. Went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon as he said unto them, I am he, they went backwards and fell to the ground. And then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake of them, which thou givest me, have I lost none. And it's at that point that Peter smites off the servant's ear. Jesus here does not try to hide who he is. He identifies himself in confidence. Now, again, there's some mixed thoughts about what exactly is going on here. Does Jesus use the name for God when he does this, and that's why they fell backwards to the ground? Others say that it was just the fact that they were coming to arrest him by night. They were trying to do this all this in a very stealthy manner because what they were doing was technically illegal. That when all of a sudden he stood up to them, it shocked them so that they stumbled. And if they're in a crowd, if the first blind stumbles, everyone stumbles. I don't really know. All I do know here is that Jesus does not back down from them. He knows he's being falsely accused. He's done nothing wrong. That's who he is. He's God. He's perfect. But so he doesn't try to hide from them. He stands up to them. And oftentimes, all it takes to put someone in their place is the confidence to stand up to them when they're doing wrong. A lot of times, someone's bullying or someone's extorting or anything like that. A lot of times we get scared and intimidated by those doing wrong, but sometimes all it takes is just being confident to stand up to someone who's doing wrong. To stand up and say, to have the confidence to stand up to them and say that they're doing wrong, or to stand up against them. And sometimes that's all it takes, and that's enough. Because oftentimes when people are doing wrong, they already inside of themselves are conflicted. And when they see someone standing up to them who is not conflicted, it causes them to doubt even further. So that's just a tiny bit of practical application. Be confident in standing up to those who are doing wrong. Whatever exactly is going on here, whether Jesus uses the name of God and the power of him using the name of God is enough that it blows them backwards, I don't know. The Bible just says, he says, I am he, and they stumble to the ground. And since it's written in Greek, the word Jehovah isn't there. It's just the term I am in Greek, which sometimes is used to refer to Jehovah, but other times it's just a statement of identification. So I don't really know, and I don't think it's important to make a dogmatic statement on that. Moving on, John 18:10. Simon, having a sword, drew it, smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. Servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? And then in the other accounts, it talks about Jesus picking up the ear and putting it back on the servant and healing him. And so, bear in mind that Jesus had told them to buy swords previously. We kind of passed over that because there was a lot of other stuff going on with the Last Supper. But during that time, Jesus tells them to go out and buy swords to defend themselves. And then here Jesus tells Peter, this is not the time to be using your sword. There would be times to use a sword. There would be times for the disciples to have to defend themselves, but this was not that moment. And so then Jesus is led away excuse me, to the house of the high priest. Band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus, bound him, and led him away first to Annas. And this is another area where John tells a different aspect of the story that none of the others do. All the others talk about him being taken straight to Caiaphas. John is the only one who mentions that they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, first. Excuse me. Probably out of respect, Annas being much older and them practicing a type of patriarchy, where the oldest male relative in a family was very highly respected, and his opinion would have been sought after. So even though he's not in a position of authority, as being older than Caiaphas, Caiaphas already being quite old himself, his opinion would have been sought after. And John would have been there too. The other Gospels talk about when Jesus goes on trial, one of the disciples goes in with Jesus. And so likely that is John, because John is the only one to record this detail. Whereas all the other disciples would have been on the outside looking in, John actually went in, and so he would have seen that Jesus goes before Annas first, before Caiaphas shows up. So that Jesus here is on trial. Can I have some of your... Thank you. My throat is very dry. All right. My apologies. All right, so here Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin. And we'll turn back to Luke chapter 22, I think. Yeah, we'll turn back to Luke chapter 22. Sorry. We'll do Matthew 26, not Luke. Matthew 26. So Jesus here is now standing before the council of the elders. We'll be in verse 57. Led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled, and there they questioned. For sake of time, we won't go through the whole thing. But basically, what happens here is Jesus is being accused of blasphemy. Bear in mind that in Jewish culture, and certainly by the Mosaic Law, blasphemy or blaspheming God, either by claiming that God was less than he was, or by claiming to be God, all of those things were punishable by stoning. But because Palestine at this time is being ruled by the Romans, the religious leaders cannot execute Jesus on their own. They have to have Roman permission to execute the death penalty. The local authorities would have had no power to do so. So if the Roman government had not been there, Jesus likely would have been executed by stoning as opposed to crucifixion, because crucifixion was a remarkably Roman form of punishment.
Yes.
But that's not what goes on here, because God, in his overarching plan, had already meant for Jesus to be hanged on a tree. And so, even though they are accusing him of blasphemy, the punishment of which is stoning, here they instead... Oh, thank you. Goodness. My throat is very dry. Instead, they have to take him to the Roman authorities. It's at this point that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Again, we don't really have time to go into the story, and it's not a focus on Jesus anyways. But recall in the last lesson Jesus prophesied that Peter would deny him 3 times, even though Peter had been the one to say, "I'll go die with you." When push came to shove, Peter did probably as many of us would do, and just kind of hid himself and used his words to deny that he ever even knew Jesus, to avoid being punished himself. Matthew is the only one that records Judas hanging himself. Again, recall that each gospel writer has their own particular area of influence, their own interests, and their own occupations before they became disciples. If you recall, Matthew was a tax collector. He was a money guy. So it would be appropriate then that he focuses on the fact that Judas is the one who went and returned the money and then went out and hanged himself. And so then the high priests, realizing that the field where he hung himself was now a field of blood, would have then just purchased the field with that money. And so it is interesting here that the money guy is the one who talks about what ended up happening to the money that was used to betray Christ. Just as Luke is a doctor, and he's the only one who mentions Jesus sweating great drops of sweat, as it were blood, among other physical aspects of what's going on. It's just interesting to note here that the money guy talks about what happens with the money. He's the only one to do so. Excuse me. Jesus then is brought before Pilate, because again, they couldn't execute him. The religious leaders had no authority to execute him. So they have to get the Romans to execute him. Now, there was only one real blasphemy in the Roman state, and that was blasphemy against the state. The idea that Caesar was a god hasn't really been introduced yet into the Roman state. That certainly would come later. And there is a bit of this idea that the Roman Caesar, the Roman emperor, was a god. But with Tiberius, that wasn't really a big thing. Because if you recall, way back in Lesson 1, we talked about Tiberius didn't even really want to be Caesar. He was made Caesar out of convenience because he was the only living male relative, or the oldest male relative at the time after Augustus died. He didn't really want to be Caesar, so the idea that someone would not recognize him as a god probably would not have bothered the Roman state too much at this point. So they have to get him on a different charge. And so the charge that they offer before the Romans is insurrection, or the idea that he was starting a rebellion against Caesar. That was an easy one. Palestine was not a peaceful place at this point. It kind of was. Herod the Great had done a lot to promote the peace of the area. But you still had small groups throughout Israel who chafed under Roman influence and wanted to overthrow the Roman government. And so accusing someone of insurrection was a really good way to get the Romans to take notice of you. And so they go before Pilate, and they basically say that he was trying to set himself up as king of the Jews. That he was attempting to overthrow the Roman yoke, to get rid of Rome, and reestablish a kingdom in Palestine. Now, of course, these were false accusations. And one thing I didn't point out in the previous, when he was being accused before the Sanhedrin, before the religious council, they couldn't even find two false witnesses to agree with each other, because this whole thing is a sham. But they go before the Romans, they accuse him of insurrection, but Pilate can't find any reason that these accusations hold up. He doesn't have an army. He isn't actively skirmishing against the Romans. There's nothing here that indicates that, other than that he's claimed to be God, that would indicate to Pilate that he is an insurrectionist. Maybe a nut, maybe crazy, but not an insurrectionist.
Yes.
And so Pilate basically looks back at them and says, I find nothing wrong with him. Just to make you happy though, I'll beat him and release him. So he has Jesus whipped. How he was whipped, I don't know. Possibly it was the 40 save 1 beating that was very common, that Paul mentions when he was persecuted as an apostle. Perhaps it was few stripes. We don't really know. Okay, but he is scourged. He is beaten. He is whipped. And then he goes back and says, "See, I've whipped him. Take him back. He's not my problem anymore." But the Pharisees stir up the crowd and basically influence Pilate to release Barabbas, because it was a feast day, and he would often, as was custom, release a prisoner to the people during a feast day. So he says, should I release Jesus, or should I release this murderer thief, Barabbas? We don't have time to go into Barabbas, but basically he was not a good guy. He was a murderer, he was a thief, he was basically a common bandit. Do you want me to release to you Jesus, or do you want me to release to you Barabbas? And the crowd calls for Barabbas to be released, significantly in the fact of how Jesus would pay the price, pay the ultimate price to save someone like ourselves, who, even though we may not have murdered someone outright, we certainly have spoken in anger unjustly towards someone. Even though we may not have stolen millions of dollars, we've stolen time, we've stolen other people's words, we may have even actually stolen money. So certainly they're a picture of what Christ was about to do. So then Pilate knowingly condemns an innocent man, in spite of the fact that his wife even comes out and pleads on Jesus' behalf, saying, I've had nothing but nightmares because of this man. You need to release him. But Pilate not wanting to have a riot, and here's the thing, we can point fingers at Pilate all we want, but this is common amongst politicians, to cow to the demands of a crowd, especially a violent-looking crowd. Rather than standing up for what they believe is right, they will instead bend because it is easier for them to bend than to have to put down a riot. And so this is something that quite frequently happens, and I mean we see it happening in our day and time all over the place. You have one particularly violent militant group that tries to stand up for something, and the government, instead of putting them down and saying, no, we can't do that because that's wrong, the government says, well, in the interest of preventing more riots from happening, we're just going to bend a little bit. And in this case, that bending meant the execution of a knowingly innocent person. As we wrap up, we're going to look more next week at the actual events of the crucifixion, but I want to point out what Jesus is going through. He was beaten when he was standing before the Sanhedrin. You can see that in Matthew 26, 67, 68. It's where they blindfold him, smite him, and say, prophesy who hit you. As we already saw, he was scourged by Pilate. Likely not very pleasant. The Romans were notoriously efficient at their punishments. They knew how much pain they could inflict without causing a person to die. So likely whatever punishment he received, whatever scourging he received, was not an easy one. Afterwards, after Pilate condemns him, he's then beaten by the Roman soldiers. That's where they put the crown of thorns on his head and smite him over the head and put the purple robe and continue beating him. He's then forced according to John, he carries his own cross. It's interesting, John is the only one to say that Jesus carried his cross. The other three all say that basically as soon as they left, Simon of Cyrene is pulled to carry Jesus' cross. Why is that? What exactly is going on here? Is there a contradiction? I have a couple of thoughts on it. If Jesus is only carrying the crossbeam, that's the 100-pound side of the 300 pounds of the cross. If he's only carrying the crossbeam, likely the idea would have been that in order to keep Jesus from dying, they would have had someone else carry the crossbeam for a certain distance. Because again, as I said, the Romans are notoriously efficient at their punishments. They knew how much pain they could inflict on a person before they would die. And for a person to die on the way to the execution would have been a huge no-no. That would have been like the Romans would have had some serious problems with a soldier who let a condemned criminal die before he could be appropriately punished. So it is entirely likely that they knew that whatever punishment they had already inflicted on him, having him carry the crossbeam all the way from Pilate to Golgotha would have killed him before he made it up. So it's entirely likely that they just pulled a random person, Simon of Cyrene, out from the crowd and said, here, you carry this until we reach the place of execution, and then he'll carry it up the hill. Bearing in mind that John is with Jesus throughout this process, it is entirely likely that John was at the place of execution and would have seen Jesus carrying his own beam, and that's why he says Jesus carrying his cross. Whereas the other three would have been amongst the crowd as Jesus is being led away, and they would have seen Simon of Cyrene. That's one guess. The other guess is if Jesus is carrying the whole entire cross beam and pole, Simon would have been carrying the back end of the cross to prevent it from dragging on the ground, which would have caused even more agony, which would have caused Jesus to pass out. I know that there's like traditions about how many times Jesus fell to the ground and things like that. That's not recorded in the Bible. What's recorded is that the Romans asked this man, Simon, to carry the cross at least part of the way. Of course, he's then nailed and hung to the cross. I'm sure we've all heard that as far as crucifixion is concerned, death comes by asphyxiation, not by blood loss. With the nails piercing the wrists and the feet, there would not have been a whole lot of blood loss from the actual crucifixion itself, but the person's weight would have worked against them to cause asphyxiation. as long as they weren't pushing on that nail with their feet. And so they would go for several days until finally they just had no more strength, and they would have suffocated to death. It was a very slow method of hanging. And of course, he's humiliated. He was stripped. I know that out of modesty's sake, a lot of images of the crucifixion have Jesus wearing some kind of covering. But history tells us the Romans had no such sense of modesty. In fact, it was preferable for the victim of crucifixion to be completely stripped as part of the punishment. The humiliation of just being out there, you can't cover yourself, your hands are outstretched, so you can't cover any of your private areas, and they would have encouraged people to walk by the cross. People are mocking. Yes, there are some people who are crying, but largely it was a public spectacle, very similar to the gladiator games or the hangings that you would have seen in England or the guillotines during the French Revolution. The whole thing was a public spectacle. And so there's all that humiliation of being up there completely exposed to the elements, no clothing whatsoever, beaten, the people on either side of him, making fun of him, and we'll look at the two thieves next week. But this is what Christ is going through. I point this out now so that way next week I can focus on more of the details. This is just kind of the general picture. But it's easy to kind of just clean up this image. We've seen so many paintings or illustrations, and I get that there is a time and a place for being appropriate. You would not necessarily put the whole gory display on details on display for something like a children's illustration, but certainly sometimes, and especially I do this myself in my own mind, I can let those cleaned up images be how I view what's going on here. But this is truly an awful, horrible spectacle, one that we here in the West who don't typically have our executions on view anymore have forgotten. Yes. And it is important to remember that Jesus went through all these things, and here's why I think it's important. Number one, he did this as payment for our sins. That is the most important reason. Number two, the servant is not greater than the master. Jesus has promised persecution to Christians as well. And this is what the world did to him. It was not an easy thing. It was not a clean thing. It was very messy. It was very, very painful. And so when persecution comes to Christians, we can expect the same. And certainly we ought to be prepared. There are places in the world where Christians face very similar persecutions for their own faith. We've been blessed in the West. We don't experience these yet. But certainly Jesus did say that persecution would come to believers. And if this is what the world has done to our master, we are no greater than our master. We can expect very much the same. And I think it's important that we remember that as we go throughout, that being a Christian means setting yourself against the world. And the world does not look kindly on people who set themselves against him. So next week, this is the sign that would have hung over Jesus' head in Hebrew, Latin. This is Greek, down at the bottom. But next week we'll look at some of the specific details surrounding the crucifixion. But we also need to remember that sobering as the crucifixion is, it did not end with Christ's death. He was taken off the cross. He is living today. So we'll look at that next week. Thanks for your attention. I'll see you then.